Right. Welcome everyone to the HAI Weekly Research Seminar. I'm Vanessa Parley, the Interim Director of Research Programs at HAI, and I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Jeremy Bailenson. Jeremy is founding director of Stanford's Virtual Human Interaction Lab and is the Thomas Moore Storke Professor at Stanford Department of Communication. Jeremy studies the psychology of virtual and augmented reality, in particular, how virtual experiences lead to changes in perceptions of self and others. His recent research focuses on how virtual experiences can transform education, environmental conservation, empathy, and health. I highly encourage you all to check out Jeremy's website, where you can find more information on his 2 published books and many fascinating papers. In his talk today, Jeremy will discuss the psychology of virtual reality and how the medium will transform the way companies and schools teach, train, operate, and build culture. Before we begin the presentation, a few logistics. You can use the Zoom chat to chat with the group, but please use the QR code on the screen to ask questions through Slido, or you can click the link that will be in the chat shortly. I will be choosing questions from Slido after the presentation, and Slido has that nice upvote feature so that I can choose questions all of you are most interested in. All right, Jeremy, thank you again so much for joining us. Feel free to share your screen and begin.
Hello, thank you for having me here, and so thrilled to see so many of you from so many places, and so thrilled to be able to talk about this work today. So really excited about the topic of today, really excited about sharing some really new research with you. So if you enjoy what we're discussing today, there's 3 ways to learn more. First, you can see the URL from my lab's webpage. We publish all of our works and put the papers online for you to read. Second, my book, Experience on Demand, sums up a lot of this. If you shoot me an email, I'm happy to give you a copy of it digitally. And then finally, at Stanford VR is our Twitter handle. We always discuss our new work and try to relate it to the world at large, whether that's government, corporation, academia, just try to discuss our findings as it relates to things in VR and elsewhere. Okay, so for the next about 45 minutes of talk, first we're going to discuss a little bit what the metaverse is and, just ground ourselves on the same topic. This is a bit of an abused word. We're then going to talk a lot about a local metaverse we built and implemented at Stanford here at the farm. We're then going to extend that to 3 different case studies: corporate training, empathy, and diversity, and then how one captures people via telepresence systems. And then we're going to leave at least 10 minutes and hopefully 15 for questions and answers. So I've been studying VR for about 25 years. My PhD is in cognitive psychology, and I've had the privilege of watching this field blossom. So when I first started doing this work, the headset all the way on the right there, you see that cost about $40,000 United States currency, very expensive. There's only about 500, maybe 1,000 good HMDs, head-mounted displays back when I started doing this work. There's now approximately 20 million of them out in the world, and out in the country, in the United States, about 20 million, much more across the globe. And one of the things we think about is now that VR has become mainstream, it costs much less than a smartphone than it does to buy a VR headset. Now that it's cheap, now that there's lots of them, what do we do in here? So this is my grandfather, Popper. He's now 96. He was a bit younger in this photo. And when he put on the goggles, he put on the headset and he looked around. And he said, you know what, this is really neat, but I don't really get the point. What am I supposed to do in virtual reality? And that's really what we're going to discuss in this talk. What are the really great use cases? What should one do? What should one avoid? And how can one leverage this medium to do very special things? So we hear a lot about the metaverse. It's become a bit of a joke among my colleagues to see how this term has gone from a science fiction quote from 1992 to a part of the vernacular. People talk about it constantly. And just to help you ground what the metaverse is, I like to really simply break the metaverse into people, places, and things. People are avatars. If you enter the metaverse, you have a self avatar. When you move in the real world, you see that avatar move from a first person perspective. There's other people. When they move, you see their movements. You get to see their mouth open when they speak. So that's the people part. People coming together in some kind of a virtual world. There's also places. You've likely read a lot about these new real estate trends where there's plots of virtual land that are selling for 7 figures inside these metaverses. There's a lot of speculating going on. Some of these places, there actually is activity. A lot of it is driven by marketing, but there is a thing we're not going to talk about today, which is really places, which is just, there's a grid. That virtual grid is consistent. That's very important. Even if you're not there, your plot of land still is. And there are people who are starting to speculate, buy, and build. And a lot of people call that the metaverse. Finally, there's things. What are things? Things are 3D models. If there's a wall or if there's a chair that you're sitting on, someone's got to make those 3D models. And a lot of the things part of the metaverse, the discussion is circulated around what's called NFTs, non-fungible tokens. These are 3D models where you know that the model of this glass is the only one that was ever made, or you know that a 2D image of a tweet was Jack Dorsey's first. And because of the blockchain, you can now know that this instance is actually the instance. And you hear a lot of energy around the metaverse being just a place to hold NFTs. And so again, we're not going to talk about places and things during this talk, but I really wanted to focus on helping you understand this definition. The metaverse is a confusing term: people, places, and things. So let's talk about people. And I want to talk about what we've done for the last 2 years here at Stanford. We have built and implemented, I'll call it a local metaverse. And we were able to port a class that I've been teaching since the year 2003 into immersive virtual reality and into a metaverse. And so we've had 263 students. Those students spent some of them 6 months, some of them 3 months, but either 3 months or 6 months. And conservatively, as a group, we have over 200,000 shared minutes together inside the metaverse. And you hear a lot of people talking about how do you use the metaverse. To my knowledge, and I think about this pretty much every waking moment for work thought, no one's ever done anything at this scale, which is putting a lot of people in VR for a lot of time and studying that process. So how did this unfold? March 2020, the chair of my department asked me to decide my teaching schedule for the next year, for academic year that is 21 and 22. And I volunteered to teach in the summertime. Professors never or rarely teach in the summertime. And I wanted to volunteer to teach summer 2021, my big VR class, the one that I'd been teaching for 20 years at Stanford, because I was hoping that in the delay of that 15 months, that the hardware would get plentiful and would get effective, that platforms would grow. I was hoping the technology would catch up enough that we'd be able to teach inside virtual reality. And so we had to make that decision, with a few months advance of the summertime, and we were able to do so. So about March of 2021, we decided, okay, hardware is good enough. There's platforms. Let's put this class into VR. And what did we need to do in those 15 months? First, we had to think about hardware. Then we had to choose a platform. We had to flip the classroom. We had to create VR content. We had to think about privacy, and we had to think about data collection. And I went quickly through those because I'm going to talk about all of them individually. But before I do that, I want to say an epic thank you, an unbelievable team that pulled off something that I've never seen in my 25 years of academia. This is not everybody, but these are some of the most amazing, bright, hardworking people that did a thing that was incredible and difficult. And what I'm talking about, I often say me, but or even we, but I really mean this amazing team of graduate students and staff that helped out. Okay, so hardware. We had to get a couple hundred sets of VR. We had to get headsets for everybody. Stanford was incredible throughout this process, and through the Course Kit program, we purchased 180 headsets. Most of them were the Oculus Quest 2s. We had some students using the Pico Neo, some students used personal computer-based VR, HTC Vives, and Valve Indexes, but we had to get 180 headsets, and we had to get them ready. We had to get the right software on them. We had to think about the proper privacy settings, et cetera. And that was a much bigger job than I thought. So for those thinking about building their metaverse at home, give more attention to that hardware configuration process. This one was took us by surprise how difficult and time consuming it was. A platform. We had to figure out what's going to be the home for people to be in the metaverse. And there's many platforms out there. I'm happy to talk more about this in Q&A. Some are good for building stuff. Others are good for having really intricate avatars. We chose the Engage platform because the Engage platform was perfect for what we were trying to do. It's really about creating content together. It's private in the sense that you can wall it off from outsiders. And the interactivity was exactly what we needed in terms of it allowed us to empower students to do things. It allowed us to capture data, etc. And we use the Engage platform. Next is we had to flip the classroom. What does that mean? So in education, people have talked about the flipped classroom for quite some time. And that means that why do we come together twice a week for an hour and a half for a lecture when that lecture can be recorded and you can watch the lecture offline? And the reason why it's hard to flip the classroom is that it's easy to record lectures of yourself, but then you've got to figure out something to do when you're together synchronously. And that's time when you used to just be lecturing to students. And so we spent a lot of time figuring out how to flip the classroom, and we had a really nice cadence. So Sunday, the students would do all the readings for that week. There's 10 weeks in the class. Every week covered a different topic. 1 week about avatars, 1 week about climate change, 1 week about education, 1 week about tracking, rendering, display. How does VR work from an engineering standpoint? And on Sunday, the students did all of the readings for that class, and they really read up on the topic. On Monday, we use Zoom, just like we're doing now, because I don't think VR is good for talking heads. If somebody's talking at you and you're writing down what they say, you don't need to have a headset on. Zoom works really well for that. So Monday, what we would do is that we would have a Zoom call where the students would really ask me questions and push deeply on the readings, so that by the end of Monday, they'd done the readings, they really understood the topic because they were asking lots of questions to me. On Wednesday, we went on what's called a VR journey. And that is, we'd all put on the headsets together and we would go somewhere. We would do something together. It was very active. We'd go to Mars and we'd explore a virtual planet, or we would build a city we'd go to a matrix blank plane and we'd all build together. And by the end of an hour and a half, we'd have a city. It was very active with the entire group. Then on Thursday and Friday, we had small group discussions, and I'll talk more about that, but about 7 people, sometimes 10 or 15, but we'd have many discussion sections each week where they would talk about their week. They would do stuff together in these very small groups. And I'm going to go into detail on each of those, but that was the cadence of the class. Sunday, they read. Monday, we dig deeper in the readings, we talk. Wednesday, we go on a journey. And then Friday, we come together as avatars in these small groups. And that was the nice cadence of it. One of my favorite Wednesday journeys, I'll just bring this up as a really neat example. We went to AltSpace VR, which is a platform owned by Microsoft, and the Reverend Jeremy Nickel and Caitlin Krause, these are 2 meditation experts, they brought us into this place that you're seeing here. Then those platforms with our avatars on them raised up into outer space. All of my students were now looking down at the earth on these little platforms in outer space. And then the Reverend and Caitlin took us through these paced breathing exercises. And we did visualization, we did a bit of meditation, and basically learned how to time our breathing while looking down at the earth. And on paper, this sounds, why would you go into VR to do that? But I'm telling you, when I asked my students what was the favorite thing they did, something about this social presence, you're around other people, and they're there to give you motivation to try to really do this and take it seriously. However, it's not judgmental. It's not as if there's a face looking at you while you're trying to, do this visualization exercise. If you were to ask me, Jeremy, would you ever meditate at Stanford in a lecture hall in front of your students? I'd say, you're crazy. I would never do that. It seems very inappropriate for me to be a teacher and meditating with my students, but something about being VR, it just gave you this nice layer. And as a person who's never really meditated in his life, something about this application really worked well. So that was Wednesday. We would do something very strange and fun and interactive in large groups. Then we'd have the small group discussions. And what's missing on Zoom, and for those of you that follow my work on Zoom fatigue, you miss this kind of nonverbal social interaction. On the Zoom grid, if I look to the left, you see me looking at another person on the grid. Now, that doesn't mean I'm looking at that person. I'm actually looking off screen, but on the grid, it looks like I'm looking at them. So in Zoom, you get this fire hose of head movements, right? There's this huge grid, but none of them are socially diagnostic. In a small group in VR, when one person looks to the other person and she turns her head, that woman in the red sweater looks at the man in the pink sweater. When she turns her head, everyone else sees that she's looking at that man, and that signals attention. It helps turn taking, and it increases what's called social presence. And so we intentionally made these very small groups, put them together for about 30 minutes, just so we can allow the conversational flow to come back to these remote conversations. Now, this was a study, and I want to talk a bit about privacy here. So Stanford helped us immensely with a number of phases on figuring out how to collect some data in an incredibly careful and private manner. And privacy was, I listed in the laundry list, privacy before data collection, because we spent 6 months on privacy alone before we moved to the other phases. And that included working with Facebook to allow them to have anonymous accounts for those students that wanted to use Oculus Quest 2. So we really thought hard about privacy, and I'm happy to talk more about that with others offline. But I want to talk about the data set. So in every group discussion, we measured at least 50 times a second. We measured the pitch, yaw, and roll, that's the rotation, and the X, Y, and Z, that's the movement of the head and the two hands, and if the mouth was opening, and the audio stream. So at least 50 times a second, we measured the body language, the actual utterances, and every event that happened in the world. The Engage platform allowed us to create these very large log files where you're basically keeping a detailed record of everything verbal, nonverbal, and event. If they spawned a 3D model, if they moved to one side of the room, all that gets dumped to a file. One of the constructs we care a lot about is something called nonverbal synchrony. Nonverbal synchrony is how people move their bodies together in groups. And so groups that are synchronous, meaning our movements are together, I'm nodding your head and you're changing your posture at the same time. When our bodies are moving together, there's lots of research for the last 30, 40 years where people show that synchrony can predict outcomes. It can predict how well a group learns. It can predict how productive and collaborative people are. But every study in the history of the world of synchrony has looked at very small numbers of people. It's very hard to collect nonverbal data. If you're videotaping people and you have to hand code it, it's very difficult to do. We've got 263 people in small groups over 6 months. And what I'm showing you here in this graph is a 20-second window, and it's 2 people. And it's not even looking at all the cues of the body. It's just looking at the amount, the velocity of head movement. So how quickly my head is moving. So you can plot the synchrony of 2 people. So you take that small group conversation and you grab 2 people, and let's say how synchronous are those people? And you can just look at one cue. I'm just looking at head, not hands, the velocity of the head. And you can plot those 2 people's head movements, and then you can slide the data files so that they move over time. And what you're seeing at time 0 is a correlation of around 0.04, 0.05. That means at the very exact same time, people's head movements are correlating in around this between 0.05 and 0.10 range. That's the typical number we get from synchrony. And then when you make the file what's called pseudo-random, when you slide the file over in time, you can see it goes down to 0. So what you're seeing here is evidence that in VR that synchrony exists. And this is not super exciting. We've shown this a number of times over the years, but just to get you a sense of how intricate one single cue, the velocity of head movement on 2 people, you can show that there is synchrony, and we know that synchrony leads to these great outcomes. Now, let's make it even more complicated. So I titled this graph, 3 is not 2 plus 1. If there's 3 people, okay, forget my nice groups of 7 or 15. If there's 3 people, when you compute synchrony, you've got 3 pairs. You've got A and B, A and C, and B and C, right? And so you can have synchrony that varies across those 3 pairings. And so I just showed you about 9 graphs here, and I literally just grabbed these sequentially. So I didn't pick them, I didn't load this graph. And this is just, if you look at, a discussion section where people break into triads of 3 people, you can see very different patterns. So look in the top middle, this is a great synchrony group, like everybody's moving together. Now look at the one, the second row all the way on the left. It turns out A and C are really synchronous, but the others aren't. And right, so synchrony takes on a very strange pattern when you look at more than 2 people. And academically, 99% of the published studies on synchrony, it's a construct that's been around for quite some time, they only look at dyads. We're looking at large groups. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is time. So this is a graph that I read when I was an undergrad. When I was a first-year PhD student in 1994, my advisor handed me this book by Alan Newell. Okay, it's called Unified Theories of Cognition, and I saw this graph, and it blew my mind as one of those kind of young graduate student moments where you think about the brain and you think about time, and you can see there on the scale, you can go down from milliseconds all the way up to months. And in academia, especially in social behaviors and collaborative behaviors in VR, people tend to be in this, minutes to hours band. But in this study, when you think about the nonverbal behavior, we're hitting the biological band, the cognitive band, the rational band, and the social band. We are looking at milliseconds when we look at reactions in Synchrony. But if you think about this class, people got together not knowing each other in these small groups. We're following them over a 10-week time period, and we're looking at how groups form. This is an incredibly rare thing in academia, to be able to study how groups form, but to do it in a way where you have every utterance captured, every flick of the wrist, every glance, sidelong glance of the head, and you can build these models that are biological, that are cognitive, that are social. And so when you think of Synchrony, and again, I'll go back up to this graph, we think about that's 20 seconds, okay? We've got months, and we've got months with hundreds of people. And it's just an incredibly daunting and wonderful opportunity to think about how we're building these models, where now we're building mathematical AI models of what it means for groups to move together, to speak together, what's turn taking mean, and we get to associate that with outcomes. How productive were they when they built something? How did they do on a quiz later on that week? And for the first time in nonverbal history, you get to really build models that at scale over time show how body movements and utterances can predict outcomes that we care about in business and in education and all contexts. Another thing we're looking at is context and quantifying context. And I say finally in the quotes because context is this word that academics and theorists use all the time. And when we theorize about what context means, we think about, what does the room look like? Are there other people present? Are you inside? Are you outside? But what will surprise people, if you're trying to ask a basic question, how does context affect learning? If you're in your dorm room, if you're in the classroom, how does context affect productivity? If you're in one of those Silicon Valley open spaces versus closed spaces, it's a question we all care about, and it's a question many people talk about. But when you actually go and read the academic studies that are proving how context affects collaboration, learning, and productivity, there's not many of them. There's a lot fewer than you think. And because in the real world, it's really hard. If I want to ask a question, how many meters should a room be to increase the productivity of a group? In the physical world, you can't build a 3-meter room, a 7-meter room, a 20-meter room, and a 100-meter room in terms of the length or the width of that room. It's just not technically feasible. So most experiments that you see published have either grabbed one room and then found another one that looks like that's a little bit bigger, or they've maybe painted the walls, and people get clever and creative, but no one's been able to look at this at scale in a quantitative manner. And what you're seeing here is a grid of my incredible team, my colleagues, who every single time there was a discussion section, the virtual scene that they were in was different. And it was different in a programmatic way. We varied how open or closed the scenes were. We varied if they were indoor, outdoor. We varied how active the room could be in terms of moving around versus not. And for the first time in history, as far as I know, there is an at-scale study looking at how context, what the room looks like, what it feels like, how that influences downstream things such as collaboration, learning, social group formation. One of my favorite terms in social psychology is called entitativity. It's how groupy is your group? Is your group like a really tight team, or are they looser? And we're studying entitativity in addition to how it forms over time, how contexts contribute to them. Okay, so that's our Stanford internal metaverse. So happy to talk more about it. But I want to now say, okay, Jeremy, you built a class that's fun and there's 200 students. How do you use this at scale out in the workplace? And I want to talk about the killer app of VR. People always ask me, Jeremy, when companies are doing really well in VR, why are people going to go into it? And I say, there's one app that's always won in VR. In 1929, the flight simulator existed because training is hard. How do we train? We try, we fail, we get feedback, and we repeat. That's how training works. And in an airplane, that's a super expensive process, right? People die and planes crash if you're iterating with mistake making and feedback. hence the flight simulator. And so when you look over the years since 1929, when VR has really won, meaning it's earned its keep, putting on those goggles are heavy and you get a little sweaty and you can't see the world. When you're going to actually put them on, training tends to win. And I'm now going to shift from my academic world to talk about a company called Striver. And Striver is a company I've co-founded, and it does training in VR. And this is just a kind of a visualization of how training works, where the ability to scale, you want it to be high, that's the x-axis, but you want it to be awesome training, you want it to be effective. And so what's the best thing in that instance is one-on-one training. The problem is that's very expensive to do at scale. If you want to scale really high, you can have videos, 2D training systems, you can have manuals, and those scale wonderfully, but it's not the same as a one-on-one tutor who's paying attention to you. And the argument I'm going to make over the next 10, 15 minutes is that VR bridges those two scales and it gives you the best of both worlds. Now, the story of how VR training at scale begins with Stanford football. And it begins with a graduate student named Derek Belch. Derek Belch was the Stanford football kicker in 2013. He was a field goal kicker. And he came to my lab to do his master's thesis. And he wanted to use VR to train quarterbacks. And when a quarterback goes to the line of scrimmage, for those that don't know American football, before he receives the snap, he's got to look around the field, and the defense is running around trying to confuse him. This is before the play is called, and he's got three options. He can let it roll, which is keep the original play. He can kill, which is go to the next play in a queue of about 3 or 4 plays, and he can do that number of times till he gets to the play he wants. And then there's often a running back behind him. He can give another command that has the running back shift. So there's basically 3 decisions that the quarterback needs to make just before he snaps the ball while he's looking at the line of scrimmage. And let me show you what this looks like. Very quick. That's all you get, that head movement. Boom. You've got to look. I'll do it again. So you're looking around, defense is twitching and moving, that guy moved his knee, and you've got to decide. And in those few seconds before the snap is called, quarterback has got to decide if he should keep the original player or go to a different one. So Derek's master's thesis trained quarterbacks to put the goggles on, and we would show them lots of plays that were designed to be with the defense of the team we're going to play this week, this Saturday, to try to confuse them. The quarterbacks, we're not teaching them how to throw and kick. They're just getting mental repetitions, looking around and making decisions. And so Derek's thesis showed that the Stanford quarterback at the time, Kevin Hogan, as well as the 2 backups, it was a psychophysics study that showed that reaction time went down in decision-making and that they made better decisions. Coach David Shaw, an amazing, brilliant, forward-thinking person that we have the privilege of working with, says that one of the reasons Stanford did so well that year, outperformed expectations, was because of this training simulation. Kevin Hogan, the quarterback, says the same thing. So Derek graduates and forms a company called Striver, and within 6 months he shocks everybody by signing a bunch of National Football League teams. So I think the first 3 months he got about 6 NFL teams to 6-figure multi-year contracts, and for the next 4 or 5 years Striver grows and trains all sorts of people in every sport you can think about, whether it's the German national soccer team or training free throw shooters in the National Basketball Association. One of my favorite apps to talk about is Olympians. So we work with the US Olympic ski team to help them visualize the course. So for those that don't know, every ski team gets 3 days on the mountain, actually. And then after those 3 days, they never get to go back again. We convinced the coach of the US Olympic team to allow us to capture in VR the mountain, the specific mountain, while we had our 3 days. Our Olympians then got to train gestalt. So this is less about making a decision of what to do and more about visualizing how they're going to move and getting accustomed to the scene. So that's a really fun use case. But the story gets really interesting. In 2016, one of the football teams we're training is the Arkansas Razorbacks. And we're in Arkansas and we're in the football office, and a guy named Brock, who is the head of training at Walmart, he walks into the football office and he puts on the goggles, he does the quarterback training, and he says, what you're doing here, which is showing a complex visual pattern, having somebody recognize that pattern, having them make a decision very quickly, and then telling others about that decision, is what every Walmart employee does every day. And what began was a journey beginning with Walmart to really bring at scale VR to corporate training. Now you may be asking, what would you do at Walmart? Why would you need VR for training? And what we did is we went through, Walmart had a book of thousands of training scenarios that they teach. And we didn't choose 200 of them. We started off with about 10 that I believed and we believed would be epic wins in VR. Things that, how would you ever not do this in VR? For example, Holiday Rush is the day after Thanksgiving. It's an utter cacophony, people everywhere, noises, getting in your personal space, people upset. And because of turnover at Walmart, only 1 in 2 employees has ever physically done Holiday Rush. So giving them these reps in VR is one example. I'll give you an example that scales up. So here's an announcement from Walmart that after we showed some efficacy, they bought 17,000 VR training stations. So think about this. There's 4,700 Walmarts in the United States. We went to every single one of them, and in the break room in the back, we have either 2, 3, or 4 VR training sets. Every single store has got headsets. When you talk about the scaled use of the metaverse, what's the first place where everyday people are putting on goggles and working together to train? It's Walmart. And lots of use cases we can talk about. I'll talk about one that I think is really, not as sexy as some of the other topics like the Holiday Rush, but this is a new device. It's called a pickup tower. And the pickup tower, every single Walmart associate, there's 1.5 million of them, had to learn how to use this new device. And using it, you have to walk around it, you've got to touch different buttons, you've got to make some decisions, you've got to talk to people. It's very procedural, it's very interactive, and it's very spatial, which is important for figuring out what goes into VR. Every single Walmart employee, before we put it in VR, the training was 8 hours long. They had to go to a specific store. Forget travel, that's on top of it. The training itself was 8 hours long. We put it in VR and it's now 15 minutes. They get the same level of expertise as they would have, but they now don't have to travel, and they've just saved an entire workday, or 7 hours and 45 minutes. Multiply that times 1.5 million and think about the savings, think about the lives saved driving. Just a great use case. I'll talk about this one because it's new. And it's important in the history of the metaverse. We've got to think about privacy in the future history about the metaverse. We're now working with Bank of America, and we are about halfway through installing VR in every single one of their 4,300 centers in the United States. In order to get VR in a Bank of America, which is an amazing use case, there's all sorts of things about conversations, about procedural learning. It's an amazing way to train. In order to get into a bank, you've got to think about security. We just announced that we're working with Bank of America. It took over a year of just focusing on privacy, security, all these layers, and we are secure. And now fintech can embrace it. And so it's a really nice use case. So I wanted to call out that the metaverse security is critically important. Not everybody thinks about that. Really important. Soft skills training. If you think about the flight simulator, all of us as managers, we talk to people. We have to deliver bad feedback. Having practice to do that is really great. Remember, VR is like the flight simulator. We want you to be able to make a mistake in VR so we can give you feedback so you don't do it in the real life. And Verizon is doing this at scale. There's a fun thing I like to say that I just learned 2 weeks ago. In one of our companies, they had required training, and then 16,000 people volunteered to do it on the side. In other words, everyone has to do the required training because VR is engaging and motivationally, people want to do it. 16,000 people at this company volunteered to do their training around human resources issues. So that's a really nice thing when you build a training that people want to do. And the final thing I'll talk about as it relates to corporate training is culture. So Sprouts Farmers Market, if those who haven't been there, they really pride themselves on their culture, the context. You walk in there and it feels like you're in a place where people care about health and they care about you. And for their employees, it's really important that people have that culture. As a cognitive psychologist in training, we think a lot about what does culture mean? How does one instantiate it? And what is it training? How can you train someone to think interculturally? And for Sprouts, what we built, before we got there, they had a PowerPoint presentation that listed their values, and they did their best on PowerPoint on, you should, think about this value of caring about someone and et cetera, about the different values. So we chose not to do that. And we used something with Doug Medine, a famous cognitive psychologist. He's come up with something called the exemplar model, which is instead of training on someone on a rule, you just give them a lot of examples and slowly that culture instantiates. And so what we did is we built a bunch of scenarios. That's what we want the Sprouts culture to be. So they'd put on the goggles and a mother would walk in and she just found out her child is gluten-free and she's very anxious because she doesn't know the right recipe, and you go with her and you take her and you show her where to go. Or one of your regulars didn't come in, but his son did, and you find out that he's in the hospital. So you take the regular's daughter and you show her where the watermelons are that he likes. And it's very not rule-based, but very experiential and example-based, and slowly the culture builds up. Sprouse loves this. They tout a 95% increase in learning of these values. And the cool thing for people who are onboarding, it's something you can do remotely. So I like this example because it bridges my work as a cognitive psychologist, thinking about, well, some things you can't train with words. It's got to be with experiences. All right, shifting topics. We're leaving corporate training, although this is certainly relevant to those who think about that. And I want to talk about a line of research that we've been doing for 20 years. And it's about giving someone perspective-taking exercises to help train them and to help them think about what it means to be someone else and what it means to be different. And so I'm going to show you a simulation we built in the year 2003. So don't make fun of my graphics in the chat there, please. And this is Nick Yee's work. And there's two theories at play here. One is called the contact hypothesis. The contact hypothesis states that if there's conflict among groups, simply by putting them together and having them have physical contact and working towards the same goal. For example, if you're integrating schools, sociologists and psychologists in the 60s argued that just having people be together is going to cause them to learn to get along eventually. Okay, so that's the contact hypothesis. The second theory here is called body transfer. And body transfer is a neuroscience finding which says that if you have a fake limb, like a rubber hand that you put down, and that limb receives, somebody touches that limb, you're not touching their physical hand, they're touching the rubber hand, but you feel somebody touching your physical hand. So you see someone touching your rubber hand, but you're feeling someone touch your physical hand. It feels as if your hand is getting that feedback, even though it's not. So the body transfer theory began with biologists showing that you can create fake limbs that have feeling. And then the VR folks overtook it to show that when you have an avatar, when somebody's moving their physical body and they see it moving virtually with them in VR, that the brain absorbs this virtual body and treats it as if it were real. And so let me show you a video of this. And so this is, you're going to see a very quick video. And again, this is 20 years old at this point. And so the subject walks around physically in the room. He goes up to a virtual mirror, and this real subjects move around for about 2 to 4 minutes. So he turns his head and you can see that move in with the avatar. He moves around a little bit and he sees those movements. He's a white male in VR, and in the real world, he bends down at the knee. We hit a button, he comes up, and he's now a woman of color. And the question that we ask in these studies is, when you are embodied in these avatars, you're now combining the contact hypothesis. It's not as if you're around someone who's different, you've become them. And then we design simulations to show when you encounter discrimination, prejudice, different types of learning while wearing someone else's body. It could be a different skin color, could be different gender, could be different age, could be a different body shape. How does that instantiate itself? And so I'll talk about a recent study done by Fernanda Herrera. Fernanda really wanted to look at these effects, but she wanted to look at them at scale with a large group and months later. And so we built a simulation by Professor Lee Ross, who just passed away. Lee Ross came up with something called the fundamental attribution error. And the fundamental attribution error states, in our lives, when good things happen to us, we tend to attribute that to ourselves, our internal characteristics, our character. When something bad happens to us, we blame the situation. It wasn't my fault, it was the situation. When we see the same thing happen to someone else, something bad, we blame their character. So when something bad happens to me, it's the situation's fault. When something bad happens to you, it's your character, something about who you are. And Lee Ross showed this effect, many decades ago. What we wanted to do was build a simulation that shows that for the homeless, a lot of us assume that it's internal, that it's about who they are, but often it's situational. And so here is becoming homeless. You lost your job, you're trying to sell things in your apartment to make rent. You don't make rent, you get evicted. Now you're living in your car and you're trying to be comfortable, but the police don't let you live in your car in this part of California. You're trying to sleep on a bus, but that guy's messing with your stuff. This guy keeps coming up to you. You can't sleep, you can't rest. And this is a simulation called Becoming Homeless. It's free online for people to download. And what Fernanda did was run some studies to show, how does this change people's behavior? We always care about behavior. And one of the variables in the study that she looked at is, if we hand you a physical petition, your job is to sign this petition. The petition says your personal income taxes will increase because we're going to build more affordable housing. What's the probability that you're going to sign this petition? The answer is that increases if you do becoming homeless in VR compared to if you do it by watching it on a screen, or if you do traditional face-to-face role-playing imagination, and that these effects last even 2 months long. So a lot of people talk about VR and empathy. In my opinion, the most rigorous work here is done by Fernanda Herrera. And look, in her studies, VR is not a magic pill. It doesn't cause people to not be prejudiced anymore. It doesn't solve all the world's problems, but as a learning tool, it shows more promise than anything else people have tried in her studies. You can also have empathy not just to other people, but to yourself. And so Hal Hirschfield ran a series of studies where a young person would put on the goggles and he'd walk up to a virtual mirror. We'd hit a button and that person's face would morph. We'd scan their face. They'd morph from a 20-something to a 70-year-old version of themselves. They'd meet their future self. We would then give them the option of having some money right now, or if you put it in a savings account, you can have more money later on. And what Hal's research showed is that compared to anything else people could get to defer gratification, visualizing your future self in VR caused people to defer gratification. So this was his dissertation work. We published this in the Journal of Market Research. But now people have been using it in products at scale. So the first one to go to market was Bank of America, and they built something called Face Retirement, which is the webcam builds a 3D model of your face. If you click yes when you form a B of A account with Face Retirement, your future self becomes part of your online banking interface, and every single financial decision you make about how much to put in savings, your future self is staring at you right in the face. And then the more money you put in a savings account, the more you think about solving this crisis of people are going to be in poverty because not enough people are saving money. Your future self actually smiles and gives you positive feedback when you put more money in savings. And so this is a nice app. Hal's done some recent work I could talk about later on as well. The final thing I want to talk about is a piece. This is the genius of Professor Courtney Cogburn. She's a professor at Columbia University. We collaborated with her to build something called Thousand Cut Journey. Thousand Cut Journey, you become a Black male. Michael Sterling, you experience racial bias as a child in elementary school, then as a teenager on the street with the police. Finally, the last scene, you are in a job interview. You're excited to go talk to the person interviewing the executive, and he doesn't even notice you in the room, doesn't even look at you. So it's a very powerful piece that we've worked now with a lot of organizations to help them put it in their curriculum. It's free online, just like everything I'm talking about today. It's free online. Thousand Cut Journey. Please look at it if you'd like. Final thing I want to talk about before we go to Q&A, and we are perfectly on schedule, is telepresence. And so if we're going to beam people in the metaverse, what's the technology going to look like? And this is Hansul Jun. Hansul and Mark Miller, they showed me a demo 3 or 4 years ago that blew my mind in just its potential, which was me being in augmented reality and having a person beamed into my room. This was not quite technologically possible, so we faked a few things. That's called a kludge. But I got to see what it'd be like to have an avatar beamed in my room. It blew my mind. We wrote a couple grants and we spent a lot of time working on this. Hansul has now got a system, and he's built it for scale. What that means is it runs from a phone. If you've got an iPhone for the 3D camera, you can capture another person's hologram simply using your phone. You can then beam that hologram to the web, or you can beam it into VR goggles. And that's, to me, is what's blowing my mind. Consul's dissertation study right now, we're doing physical therapy in the metaverse remotely using his telepresence system, where a therapist gets to watch you and walk around you while you're doing squats and lunges and all these other things. It's fairly incredible. And it's free. So if you go to Hansul's app, you put it online, it's called Telogy, and it's free on the App Store. And if you have a 3D camera or a smartphone, you get to play around with it. So please use it. The final thing I want to talk about is in the telepresence space. 25 years ago, when I came to Stanford, and before that, when I was at UC Santa Barbara, I created a theory called transform social interaction. And what transform social interaction is, it says that in VR, you can transform. And we ran studies showing that teachers could simultaneously look at many people at once, or automatically I could mimic your head movements, and subconsciously you'd like me because of the mimicry. We've done things where you can be taller and therefore you're more aggressive in a negotiation, or more attractive and therefore you have confidence in social scenes. But it's fun when you write these theories 25 years ago and now the market catches up.
Thank you so much for your talk. Like, so many threads I wanna pull there, but we don't have time for everything. So let's see. Yeah, so the first question that a good amount of our audience is interested in is from Marlene Braun. And she mentions that last summer, she says, last summer, my group tried organizing a 1-week summer course, almost completely in virtual reality. But after 30 minutes, the users needed to take a break. So do you have any recommendations on how to extend this time? And then there's a related question from Roger McDonald on any significant progress made around dampening VR's visual vestibular sensory disorientation.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. I have a 30-minute rule in my lab, in my class, in my life. I don't use VR that often in my life outside of work. 30 minutes is enough. VR is still, the hardware is amazing, but it's still a hard thing on the perceptual system. So after 30 minutes, take it off, touch a wall, take a break. And the other thing is most things shouldn't be in VR. So for the class you made, you go in VR to be together or to do something constructive. And maybe that's an hour and you need to take a 5-minute break at the 30-minute mark. But in general, 30 minutes tends to be enough. So I like the 30-minute rule. And I love that your limit actually coincides with the formal rule that we have in my lab and class. On the vestibular cues, one of my favorite things to try out, there's an app called VZ Fit, and it violates everything I thought was going to cause simulator sickness. You're on an exercise bike, stationary, and you're pedaling. The pedaling is driving the forward translation. And then instead of, in VR, you're seeing all sorts of things. You're riding a horse and lassoing people. It's utterly incredible. And they've got a lot of really neat things they do with how they're letting the head guide the field of view that's reducing simulator sickness. So you asked us who's pushing the boundaries in that one. I think VZ Fit is a really nice product that's doing that. There's some great work by Misha Shra where she electrically stimulates, she's a professor at UCSB, electrically stimulates the vestibular system so that when she does moves like put you on a roller coaster, that they're less harsh. I think that's got some promise, but I think we still have a long way. The best thing for VR is never, ever move the camera. In other words, if the scene moves, it's because you moved your body. And that's the way to avoid simulator sickness.
Good. Thank you. So then a few questions about application. Dr. Stephen Charlap is wondering how you would imagine an encounter, and you kind of talked about this, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit, an encounter between a person and a digital human doctor. And then also there's a question from Tim about applying the technology for stroke victims and their rehabilitation.
Yeah, so let me start with the second one because I just couldn't be more excited about stroke rehab. And so when we look at the academic work for the last 30 years and say, well, where is there a hole in people's everyday use? That's stroke rehab. So when you have a stroke, obviously a horrible thing, you get visual neglect, you can't see certain parts, and then you have to rehab you have to do physical movements for rehab. And if you have a stroke, the technology that most humans on the planet receive are things like take a piece of chalk and draw circles or things like that. And it's not as if I don't think I'm supportive of that, as you should do physical things, but in VR, it's such a great tool. You put on the goggles and you can adjust things for visual neglect. You can have them follow very specific paths and move their bodies to the exact same thing you should do for the perfect path of movement for a therapist. You can record all the data so later on your doctor, she can go over things and know exactly how you move. You can gamify it to make it engaging. And it's a lot of academic work on this, but up until recently, there hasn't been a product. And there's a company called Penumbra, a medical device company here based in Oakland, that has now got a product. It's called the Real System. And I'm just so thrilled that now patients are able to get it, because up until recently, it's been one of the neglected epic wins for VR is stroke rehab. On the visiting your doctor side, I think that's great, but I think in general, Zoom works for a lot of that. Why we're doing physical therapy for Hansul's dissertation is because for that, you really need to see the person's body and you really need to see it dynamically while it's moving. And then there needs to be two-way feedback. So for those types of visits, I think VR is going to be great. For everything else, like all of you on the call, it's already an epic win to not have to drive to the doctor, sit in the waiting room just to answer a few questions, and to be on Zoom instead is just life-changing in terms of our calendars.
Good. Yeah, I think about the doctor's appointments I've had over COVID time and the ones that I just couldn't do on Zoom, but the ones on Zoom were great and perfect. Yeah.
Right. So I'm not, again, I don't think VR is for everything. I don't do it in my personal life. I have a 30-minute rule. For the thing that it's awesome for, do it. For the others, do what you were doing previously. VR is going to be VR is not going like this. We used to joke about, there's a famous joke, VR is going to be in your living room next year, every living room, everywhere. And every VR person said this for the last 20 years. And I think as a field, we've stopped. I think that we're happy with this nice curve that's going to go that way without, looking for that exponential hockey stick.
Good, good, good. Let's see. Yeah, so this one is more about how the brain processes the VR. So as I understand it, right now our brains currently respond to the VR as if it is real. Like we can't really tell the difference when the technology is done well. And I know that there's ongoing research and AI techniques to make virtual reality even better. So if we are to use virtual reality more consistently, is that going to change, or how do you envision that changing, like how we interact with each other or the world or think about things?
Yeah, so in general, when we look at physiological response, look at behavior, look at how people talk, look at, some studies looking at brain activation. That's complicated because you can't really move and measure brain activity well at the same time. In general, we find that people tend to treat VR similar to how they do real world stuff. So the way you respond to a flinch, the way that you respond to somebody who invades your personal space, we get this similar reactions, though that is still an evolving field. The question about what happens when we get used to it over time, there just aren't many data sets in the world to answer that question. One reason why I'm utterly just blown away with anticipation with this huge data set that our team is currently analyzing about the metaverse classes, where we have the answers to some of those questions, which is what happens over time. Is it a novelty that wears off, or do you learn how to use this in a way that's better? And our data, without giving away much because the students are still working on the details, we're showing more that it's a growing accommodation pattern as opposed to a novelty pattern, meaning the more they use it, the more they tend to want to use it, get accustomed to it, to see its efficacy. And that's really the only data set. There's just not much work on repeated use. And that's why I'm really excited to be doing that right now.
Yeah, so then, yeah, somewhat related, like, are there aspects of virtual reality that you're concerned about or you think needs more research before it's deployed broadly?
It all needs more research. I mean, there's been, the number of people on the planet who've been studying the social and psychological aspect of VR. You could fit them in an elevator for the last 20 years. So we need more work, absolutely. And when I think about the downsides of VR, I think about, number one, I think about distraction, meaning you can't see the real world. And so I worry, before I think about the lofty things I'll talk about in a second, I worry about stepping on the cat or walking into a plate glass, sliding glass door. And then I'll say, because we have a lot of people on this talk and HAI has got good reach, my biggest ask to the world is I want VR to not work in a moving car. I'll say it again. I want VR to not work in a moving car. You may say, Jeremy, no one would ever use VR in a moving car. And I say we have a data point on this. It's a video game called Pokemon Go, where people were driving while looking through their camera phone. And we know of a number of car accidents that occurred while people were playing Pokemon Go. You may say, what about the passengers? And I'll say, well, they can read a book. You may say, what about driverless cars? What are you going to do? And I say, if you talk to the people who invented the smartphone, and I do, I work with the tech companies. I advised the president of Samsung for 5 years on VR strategy. And I would say, if you got to go back in time and you could save 10 lives every day, 10 humans in the United States are killed every single day because somebody is texting and driving. Think about that. Just so we can talk on the phone while driving, 10 people have to die. And I say, well, okay, going back in time, I realize we can't put that genie back in the bottle, but with VR, you can. Can we make VR not work in a moving car so that people aren't killed by others driving cars while in VR? So anyway, that's my distraction. Number two is addiction. Very little research about addiction. What's going to happen when the things are so good that you don't want to go to a real party? How do we think about that? We think about overuse. So I do a lot of research on simulator sickness. We have a 30-minute rule. We don't move the camera. We tend to use better hardware that can update it to 90 hertz and have better tracking, but overuse can cause simulator sickness. We think about learning bad habits. In my opinion, because VR uses your body in a natural way, there's things that when you do in VR are a little different than when you do it with a 2D interface. And my standard for people on that is, if there's something that VR is great for, things that you can't do in the real world, go to the moon, become that singer you've always wanted to be, it's not great for things that you wouldn't do in the real world. So if there's an activity that if you did it in VR, you'd feel horrible that day. Sorry, an activity that if you did it in the real world, you'd feel horrible about yourself that day. You couldn't look in the mirror. You couldn't look at your loved ones. You probably don't want to be doing that in VR, and certainly not too often. So we talked about addiction, distraction, overuse, and learning bad habits. And I'll pause there. But yeah, those are the things that keep me up at night.
No, that's great. And then, we've talked a lot about virtual reality. Do these, do your thoughts remain for augmented reality? Are there differences we should think about?
So from a so for those that don't know, virtual reality, you're totally immersed. It's complete transportation. With augmented reality, you still can see light from the real world, and you're just augmenting the digital layers on it. Could be putting names on over someone's head to know their name. It could be, putting a big pit in the middle of the physical floor and having dragons pop out of it. And so psychologically, AR is more, we think about multitasking than we do about mental complete transportation. So I got really fired up about AR for a couple of years, and the lab did a bunch of research on, what happens when you're at a cocktail party and there's 10 physical humans and then there's 10 ghosts. And those 10 ghosts, half the people get to see the ghosts because they've got AR and the other half don't. And how does the social scene evolve when I don't want to walk through a ghost, and instead of walking through a ghost, I smash into a real person because I was so worried about the bird. So we did a lot of work on that. In general, the hardware for VR is so much more robust and available and affordable that's where my efforts have gone. I got excited about AR. We still do academic basic research, but the thing about VR is that it's growing at a pace where we need to answer some of these questions. And so I would say most of my efforts toward VR than it is to AR.
Great. So we've got one more minute. I want to ask one more question. Let's see. Yeah, so you talked about in your talk about training and using the virtual reality in training settings. Is there any work, are you familiar with any work, you doing any work on the acceleration of skills or capabilities, or like the long-term effectiveness of
yeah, so this is the amazing part about getting to work with a company like Walmart, because we trained, I don't know if I said this earlier, we've trained over 1 million Walmart employees in VR. And you can look at when they train, how they train. When I would say how they train, I mean, where they're looking, what decisions they're making, how often they train in VR. You can pair that with data about promotions 2 years later, right? And so the models we're building, these machine learning models, and to be frank, you don't even need machine learning for a lot of them, though you do for some. You get to have the ultimate label training set, which is how do they do in their job years later. So it's a different type of efficacy data that we get to use. And the answer is, like everything in the world, it depends. It depends how you use it, what it's used for. But yeah, it works, and it works down the road.
Awesome. Great. Okay. Well, no, thank you so much for joining us. That is all the time we have for questions. And thank you to our audience for all of your thoughtful questions. And we hope to see you all at next week's seminar with Amy Ziegert discussing her new book, Spies, Lies, Algorithms, and the History of the Future of American Intelligence. You can sign up at our website. And thank you again, Jeremy. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you. So great to be here. Appreciate you having me. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.